All right, my friends, if you got to see the newsletter this week or you knew what the service was about, you may have heard the words or read the words interactive. It's not just the kids who are going to help make poetry today. If you're newer here, you may not know that I used to be a middle school teacher, and that's where this comes from. So we are poetic people. Even those of us who feel like we're poets, that we're not good at writing poetry, we recognize poetry, right? We all recognize roses are red, violets are blue, I hope. And I have found that for someone who does not feel like a poet, that just the act of creating words can sometimes be a struggle. But then when I do it, I feel a sense not just of accomplishment, but almost like rocket fuel inspiration. Like, ooh, I could do things. Yeah. And I feel like finding the right words is sometimes really hard to do, especially when you look around and you see all of the terrible words that are on the news, in our social media feeds, right? We are constantly bombarded with negative words, with negative messages. And so the idea that we might create something of beauty, of meaning, of silliness, right, can in itself be an act of both resistance and resilience. So if you're feeling a little nervous about participating, I get you. That's why we're doing something that is both a team-building exercise, is very creative, but is also very individual, right? And so no one is going to know how much you participate in this ritual, we'll call it. This is a poetry exercise that we call in middle school the exquisite corpse. If you've ever done this, it is a process of making a poem together, line by line, and each person is only responsible for one line. That's all you got to do. Think of one thing to write down. Could be roses are red, violets are blue, right? And we're going to create this poem together based on a prompt. So the invitation is for everyone here in the sanctuary. Friends online, I'm very sorry. I could not figure out how to make this more interactive with just me here. But if you want to put something into the Zoom chat to create some poetry for yourself, please do so, and I will try to include it in some way. But I got too many balls in the air right now. But friends who are here in person, I have pens and I have these 2 clipboards. And here's how this works. There's a prompt on each one, right? One prompt here, the first line that I started for you. You're welcome. You don't have to figure out how to start it. Whenever I'm frightened, I tell this story. That's the first line. If the clipboard comes to you, your task is to simply write the next line. Doesn't have to rhyme with the word story. Doesn't have to be profound. Doesn't have to feel poetic. Write whatever comes to you, right? Whenever I'm frightened, I tell this story. So you would write here on this next line. This is lined paper, so hopefully that makes it easier. Then when you're done, you're going to fold the paper over your line, right? Or actually over the first line, so that the person behind you can only see the line of poetry that you just wrote, right? They can't see the rest of it, right? So I'm gonna actually write another line and then fold it over so we get started here. But that's all you do. You write one line of poetry, and then you fold the piece of paper over so it covers everything before what you just wrote, right? So that the person behind you, we can't see the whole picture. We only see the thing that came right before. And we create this poem line by line. I can't promise it's going to be Shakespeare. It's probably going to be very silly, and that'll be okay. But occasionally when you do this, if you've ever done this with middle schoolers, you actually get something very profound every once in a while, right? Just the synthesis of people's minds coming together and creating something is very, very powerful. Okay. Are there questions, comments, or concerns? If you want to run for the hills, I understand. The bathroom is at the rear and down the stairs. Coffee is downstairs. I totally get it. There are 2 clipboards here, and they have different prompts, right? One says, whenever I'm frightened, I tell this story. The other starts out, When we tell a story, we are living memory. Doesn't have to mean anything to you, but it might help. Whenever I'm frightened, I tell this story. When we tell a story, we are living memory. Okay? Sandy, do you want to start? Beautiful. I'm buzzing here. All right. I'm going to give this pen to Sandy to write on and then pass back, please. Hello. Sorry about that. And then on this one, goodness gracious. Sorry about that. On this side, Sharon, can I ask you to start? I'm putting you on the spot, I recognize. When we tell a story, we are living memory. Okay, so we have pens to pass back. This is going to take a few minutes, and that's okay, because I'm going to talk to us while we're doing it. Right? And tell you about the power of words. When I was a middle school teacher, I had the honor and privilege of teaching in New Haven, Connecticut. And I had a student who was going through a rough time in his life. He was having a really hard time connecting with anyone else. I came in as a young white male teacher into a predominantly black and Hispanic school in New Haven, Connecticut, desperate to make connections. I was a little bit lucky because I was also the basketball coach, so that was an instant way to make connections. But with this young man, he was just having a really hard time. And so one of the first things I did when we were having a study hall period, when the kids are supposed to be silently working, and if you've ever taught middle school, you know that that is a rarity. But most of the kids were working, and this young man was just kind of sitting there zoning out, daydreaming. And so I walked up to him, and I was like, hey, do you have anything to do? He said, no. Which I knew was a lie, but I was like, okay. And he had a piece of paper out, and it was just blank. And he'd been staring at a blank piece of paper for 15 minutes or so. And his assignment was to make a poem. And he didn't know where to start. He said, I'm not good at school. I don't like words. I don't like writing. So he was just staring at this blank piece of paper. I said, well, give me a person, place, or thing. And he said, car. I said, okay, tell me more about this car. And he said, Chevy Impala. I said, wow. I said, do you like cars? He said, yeah, I like cars. I said, oh, have you ever been in a Chevy Impala? He said, yeah, my uncle has one. I said, oh, that's amazing. Well, what color is it? And as he's telling me these things, I'm just writing them down on the side of the paper. Just the words, the colors, the shapes, all that stuff. And I said, all right, you wrote your poem. He said, what? I said, yeah, you wrote your poem. He said, no, I didn't. I said, read these words out loud. You know, and it was Chevy Impala, 67, Pearl. And it was just random words. I said, you did it. You put words on the page. He said, well, that's not good. I said, oh, okay, well then let's make it better. And so we took these words, and then we started this exercise of, say, okay, I'm going to write first. And I wrote something about, my uncle's car, right? And then I wrote another line about my granddad's truck. If you've been here for a while, you might have heard stories about my granddad's truck. And then he wrote some lines. Then I wrote some lines, and then he wrote some lines. And we created this silly poem that had to have a certain number of poetic contraptions in it. But I could feel this connection starting based on this very simple exercise. This young man and I got really, really close because he lived 2 towns over from the school. So he was not eligible for the bus. So he was taking the city bus of one town to the next town and then transferring to the other city bus to come into New Haven and then walking from the bus depot to get to our school. So it was 2 hours and 15 minutes, I think, from his house to our school. And school started at 6:45 or something. So he'd get there every day and he would just be so sleepy. It was unsustainable. And it was a situation I'm sure you can imagine, right? A single family, single parent household, all these things. Through this process that started with words on a page, it became tutoring sessions, it became coaching sessions, it became me picking him up and dropping him off at school. It became a fabulous, not only mentoring relationship, but kind of a familial relationship. And it started with poetry. And if you'd have asked me, when I was a young teacher coming into this school, how are you going to make connections with the kids? I'd have said, well, I know a lot about hip-hop music. I know a lot about sports. And I think I'm pretty funny. And I like to have a good time and joke around. I never would have thought something that I did not connect with when I was in school would be the key to unlock this door. I tell you this story not to lift up that I was an amazing teacher. I was a pretty mediocre teacher, to be quite honest with you. But I was really good at connecting with kids, especially those that were having trouble connecting with anyone else. And it wasn't because I always knew the right words to say. And it wasn't because I knew the right words to write on a paper for this 8th grade assignment. Right? It's because I think I was willing and able to show up and be open and vulnerable and just try something. Right? That the courage that I think we all can find in times like these, quote unquote, unprecedented times, the courage that we can all find and have, the most important courage in this space, in these times, is the courage to show up and be open and vulnerable and to connect with people. Especially people that might be different from us, but sometimes that can be unsafe, right? But I'm especially thinking about here in this congregation, the courage to show up and try to connect with people, even when it's imperfect, even when it doesn't work, right? Even when you don't know the words to say to someone, it can be really life-changing. And that courage to show up and try something imperfect is in itself a kind of poetry. If you've ever heard me talk about what it means to be a minister of presence, one of the things that we learn in seminary is how to do pastoral care, how to come to people when they're sad, when they're feeling alone, when they're hurt, when they're in the hospital. And there's lots of ways to do it, right? There's lots of theories on how to do it. My pastoral care instruction and my great supervisor, Reverend Chaplain Dr. Robert A. Renix, used to talk about the words of your body and the words of your presence are the poetry of the divine to this person. The words of your body and the words of your presence are the poetry of the divine to this person. That is literally not about what comes out of your mouth. Because if you've ever been in hard situations and someone has come to you looking to help, sometimes the things that come out of their mouth are actually not helpful at all, right? They actually make it worse. But the things that come out of our mouths are sometimes less important than the words that come from our bodies, from our presence, from our spirit, from our aura, some people say, from our vibes. And that's what I want to lift up today on this Memorial Day. Memorial Day weekend, on a time when we think about victims of military oppression, those who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces and those who have been victims of those armed forces. We think about those who have gone on before us And that these memories, as Amanda Gorman says, these memories tell us a story. And it's not just about telling the story, it's about remembering the story. And it's not just remembering with our minds, it's also embodying these stories. She talks about tasting, touching these memories and these stories. Heather Hackett's poem talks about coming together, building the strongest rope, not just with our words, but with our whole selves. For Memorial Day, for me, I try to be more mindful, not just of those who have died while serving in the armed forces in our nation's history, but for all those who have been victims of any kind of systemic oppression from this land, right? When we think about who ought to be memorialized and whose memory teaches us something going forward, I'm working to be more mindful of the other pieces of that story, the other poems that are not often told, and the poems that may not have words to be shared, but the poems that are shared by our bodies, by our lived experience. And when I try to show up and connect with someone, I want to know that story too. So when I sat next to this young man in New Haven, Connecticut, his body was telling me a story. His presence was telling me a story, not with words, right? He was creating this poem that was one of confusion, despair, tiredness, apathy, hopelessness. And it was the hopelessness that I thought we could fix. I couldn't fix everything. I wasn't meant to fix everything. But what I find is when we gather together in community, in spaces like this, and we do rituals, like joys and sorrows, like singing together, like creating silly poems, we're telling a story. We're making poetry with our bodies that can both inspire and lead someone towards hope, as Heather Hackett says. So what I'm inviting us to do on this Memorial Day is to think not just about veterans and those killed in our service, but to think about all of the sacrifices that have been made, not just for us and not just by us, but those sacrifices made because of us here in America. And to expand our consciousness about Memorial Day with the intention of trying to lead back to hope. So stay with me here. I'm going to try and tie this with a bow. To expand our thinking about Memorial Day, not just to about the armed forces, but to anywhere there has been victims of systemic oppression of what we call empire, right? The American empire. And to think about the stories that those people might tell, could tell. Not just with words, but with their bodies. And what can we hear from that story? What can we remember from that story, from that poetry of their lives, that helps lead us back to hope and helps lead others to hope? Because, this is my theory, if we do this work here in this little congregation, if we kind of fill our hearts, expand our hearts, think about all the people outside and bring those stories into our own lives, right? Bring their poetry into our poetry. Take their lines of poetry and add ours to it. And create this new thing that leads us back to hope. The next time something bad happens, the next time we feel frightened, we have not just our own well of words hiding around up here to draw on, right? We have inspiration and stories from other kinds of people from different times, different places, different understandings, different expressions. I'll give you one example, because I think we're just about done here. Are we done at the back? Everyone's written. Are we done at the back over here? We're getting close. Okay. I'll give you one example of this. Thank you. Ooh, in these unprecedented times, we look for words from people who have lived in situations like this. And we hear these stories, right? So we can look to stories from resistance to the Nazi regime, right? From resistance to genocide in African countries. We can look to the civil rights movement here in America. And oftentimes what I find is when I read these stories that I didn't know about, I feel an instant sense of connection to these people. I say, oh, if they can do that, then maybe I could do that too. I'm emboldened by those words, by the poetry of their lives. And I'm led back to hope. That whenever I'm feeling frightened, whenever I'm feeling scared, whenever I'm feeling hopeless, I draw on these words, this poetry, not just like Heather Hackett's poem, but the poetry of people's lives, their lived experience, of ministers who have gone before me, of people who have gone before me, of my family members who have gone before me. And that memorializing does me a lot more good, I think, than just thinking about Memorial Day in this very narrow sense, right? Which is still important. And what leads us back to hope is my question. I'm hopeful that one of these poems will do that. And at the very least, I'm hopeful that this ritual, while it may seem silly, sparks a memorializing for us to think about how we are connected not just by the words of our minds, but by the words of our bodies. And if not, there's another Sunday coming around. We'll try again next week. All right, how are we doing back there? Just about done? Okay. Thank you, friends. So we're going to read our poetry together. I'm going to read it out to us. We're going to extinguish our chalice, and then we are going to end our service here today. We're good, Brenda? Thank you. Fabulous. Beautiful. All right. Quick show of hands. Anybody ever done this exercise before, either as a teacher or a student? A handful of folks. Great. Okay. This is our brand new poem. It's going to lead us back to hope and solve all of our problems. Okay. Whenever I'm frightened, I tell this story. But look up, the sky is blue. I can be like the sky too. My ancestors faced many difficulties and made it through. They did this so that I wouldn't have to. And I persist so no one else has to either. My courage encouraged all those around me, and my courage helps to ground me. The courage to say, everything is going to be all right. I breathe in and out. As I went to cut my irises, I saw the bee enjoying them and stopped. And I wondered, how does this bee know he has gathered enough pollen? Call the plumber. Being present in a moment is joy. Joy in penguins. Here come the joy in penguins, maybe. I'm not sure about that last line. Joy in penguins. Here they come. Joy in penguins. Here they come. Amen. Thank you, friends. Beautiful. Yeah, give yourselves a hand. Beth, are you the last one or have you gone? Linda's the last one? All right. Beautiful. Yes. So while we're here, I'll make two quick little announcements. One, next Sunday, June 1st, is our flower communion. This is the annual end-of-year ritual that lots of UU congregations celebrate. People do it at different times. We often do it on the first Sunday in June. So we are going to have a table here with flowers already brought. But the ritual of flower communion is that you are invited to bring a flower or a few flowers from your home, from your garden, from the side of the road, from the flower store if you want to buy some. Thank you, Beth. And bring them here. We will have flowers available for folks who cannot bring one in for whatever reason. But if you want to bring your own, we really encourage that. It helps make the ritual more complete. So if you want to bring a flower next week for flower communion, please do so. Secondly, after the flower communion, we're going to have lunch on the lawn outside to celebrate the end of our year. There might be ice cream. And there's also going to be a small soil ceremony over at the garden. So if along with the flower, if you want to bring a very small container of soil from your garden, from your house, from the side of the road, please do so. And we're going to create a little ritual for our garden over there. Okay? All right, friends, here we go. Our next poem that's going to solve everything and bring us back to hope. When we tell a story, we are living memory. Memories that pour from clouds to rivers, then seas. Telling the rest of the world about all the lives they've lived. And all the cats are singing the meow, or all the cats are singing the moon to come down. Lives lived in beds and chairs, in gardens and on roofs, like daffodils and tulips blooming in their time, giving way to irises. Reciting the powerful poem of hope, the strongest rope from now on. So I took a deep breath and breathed out hope. I took another breath, anchoring my resolve to act. Sometimes just breathing is a form of resilience, and a dark cloud can give way to a rainbow. A rainbow, rain and sun, pain and fun can free us. And as depression and addiction in my family has made me grateful for community and health. Amen. All right, friends. I think